Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the ZapSec Modernization Series. I'm Carl Schneider, Vice President at ZapSec, and I'm joined by Ray Garg, who's our IAM architect. Ray, I wanted to talk some about some patterns I've been seeing recently in conversations around enterprises that are scaling digital products past a single market. Right, the first brand they launch that may go fine, the authentication works, the consent flows are compliant, data stays where it needs to stay, right? And then they roll out to another market, and then a third, and maybe somewhere around the fourth market, somebody realizes that the identity architecture was never really built for this kind of scale.
Yeah, and I mean there's so much revenue opportunity across scaling across regions. These are sensitive operations that we need to account for. And by that point, these workloads are already in production, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I can envision basically what you end up with is obviously end up with separate customer identity and access management stacks per region, right? Because you have that data residency aspect of it. The consent records might get commingled. You've got compliance actually probably spending more time auditing identity configurations than the actual risk involved.
Yeah, the instinct to isolate by duplication does make sense. You need to isolate, by data residency requirements. When a new region launches, you would deploy a new CIAM tenant to meet that residency requirement. But as each deployment evolves independently, the coordination overhead grows faster than the actual regulatory requirement that we were solving for.
And I can imagine, but let's get down to the brass tacks here. What specifically breaks?
Yeah, I mean, we see three things compound. We see policy drift, where each instance diverges because different teams configure them at different times. Consequence of that is that you no longer have a consistent global security posture. So every audit, every brand launch, every regulatory review becomes a region by region exercise instead of a platform level assurance. We also have token and tenant scope leakage where tokens are not bound to their correct tenants and audiences. So tokens from tenant A could theoretically reach some services in tenant B that's not supposed to. And then we also have consent contamination, where consent records are not isolated per tenant, which means you can't prove that a customer authorized data use for that specific tenant. And under GDPR and other strict data residency laws, that distinction is not optional.
Okay, okay. So you've made the point. What does the architecture look like when you're designing for this from the very start?
Mhm. Yeah, so we tend to look at designing identity as a platform with isolated tenants and a shared services layer. So each region or brand operates within its own cryptographic and policy boundary, but the intelligence layer, the risk signals, the automation, and the governance controls that ZapSec integrates into this, they allow, that operate those things operate centrally and propagate consistently across the tenants. So each tenant is provisioned with independent signing keys. It has tokens that carry tenant scoped claims and audience restrictions that are valid only within that tenant's boundary, and consent records are isolated and stored where data residency requires. Policies are able to inherit from a shared baseline, but they enforce independently.
Ah, okay. So that's that shared layer that makes the difference, right? You still have the independence of the tenants themselves, but you get the commonality across all of them that you can enforce that kind of global aspect that needs to be applied. And that's ZapSec's secret sauce, right?
Exactly. That's where we bring in our thought leadership there. The risk telemetry layer is shared. So anomaly detection, threat signals, credential stuffing patterns, and attack targeting, let's say the North America region, that would surface to the, Europe tenant, right? And so that, we have isolation that covers data, consent, and authorization, and the intelligence layer benefits from the full picture.
Yeah, that this is awesome, but I have to assume that some real governance discipline is required to maintain this.
Definitely, it definitely does. So, tenant provisioning has to be templated, it has to be automated. We have to have baseline policies across the tenants. We have to have key rotation, policies, consent schemas. All of these things have to be codified. So that's the difference between a platform that scales linearly and one that scales with compounding overhead.
But see, linear cost scaling, that's what CFOs care about, right? And the CISO wants to audit one model with tenant level variations rather than five implementations with five different drift patterns. Yeah, I love it. So, like, basically, if an enterprise is going to operate in multiple markets, multiple geos, the question is not whether they need tenant isolation, it's whether they design it intentionally or they discover the gaps during an audit or breach investigation or a launch that takes 4 months instead of 4 weeks.
Correct. Yeah, I mean this leads to the decision whether it really takes that, it's it done in a scope time or takes a lot longer than intended. And the way we would, start is with an architecture review. We would map the current tenant boundaries, we would identify where, tokens are being generated from in those token policies. We would identify those consent policies and see where they're not scoped correctly. Most enterprises can sequence that in 90-day increments without disrupting their live scenarios.
Oh, right, right. Okay, but they got to start that way. But basically, design the boundaries now, enforce them consistently, and then you can scale without the surprises. That's awesome. Listen, Ray, thanks for these insights. I think it's hugely helpful. And I want to thank our audience for watching. I want to remind everybody that ZapSec helps enterprises design multi-tenant customer identity and access management architectures that scale without compliance exposure. Because we do identity every day. We've been there, we've done that. And if this reflects what you're working through, we'd welcome a conversation about how to bring this kind of transformation to your organization. So reach out, visit us at zapsec.com, or you can email myself or Ray directly. Our email address is at the beginning of the video.